All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in today, and we're going to get into another Bible decode coming from the New Testament, and as we've been doing all along, and we're looking at the book from Michael Maniscalco called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, which just came out about 6 months ago, and Maniscalco is one of, that's Menasgotz, and he is one of many authors, especially recently, who have been going with the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is that the New Testament, or in Maniscalco's case, really he just focuses on the Gospels, were written not by a bunch of semi-literate Judeans, but by the Roman Caesars and their lackeys, their relatives and their associates living at Caesar's palace in Rome. And in particular, the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, and that is Vespasian and his two sons, Titus and Domitian, who ruled Rome from the whole empire from 69 to 96 AD. And basically, according to this theory, the Romans wrote the Gospels and they backdated it by 40 years. And so they set Jesus's ministry up from 30 to 33 AD. And at the same time, they wrote a history of a war between the Romans and the Jews, called War of the Jews, or Jewish War, from 66 to 73 AD, but in particular focusing on 70 to 73 AD. And that was a book by an author named Josephus, and Josephus being just a pen name or alias of one of the insiders to the Caesar court, probably some guy named Arius Piso, who was a kind of like a shadow emperor under both Titus and Vespasian. And so one of the main patterns that you can see between these two books that has given rise to this whole theory is that, first of all, these are the two only, really, only works that were written in the first century that have survived. Josephus's War of the Jews and his other writings, including his autobiography and his later book called Antiquities of the Jews. And they're not books. This War of the Jews is 7 volumes, and Antiquities of the Jews is like 20 volumes. They're pretty short volumes, but they're, cumbersome books. Along with the New Testament, there's nothing else there. So historians rely on Josephus being a true history of what happened. And so this doesn't just really discredit the New Testament, but it discredits like everything from the first century. And then many other authors are discrediting a whole lot of other stuff based on this. And so this is not just like a target on Christianity. It is really a targeting on a great deal of Western civilization, especially when you go down the road of Abelard Reuchlin and Roman Piso, who claim that Arius Piso, not only did he write the New Testament, and not only did he write Josephus, but he also wrote stuff like Aristotle. And even though Aristotle wrote 400 years before that, Aristotle, according to them, was just like this kind of, he wrote a book or two on something like having to do with natural history or possibly biology or something like that. And then Arius Piso added like all of his works under that same name. And he wrote as all of the church fathers, and his whole family was in on it, and they became all the popes. The first 30 popes were directly related to Arius Piso. And so, but then you can go even further to go to James Ballantyne Hannay, who was writing in the early 20th century at Oxford. And he claims that not only did the Romans write the New Testament, but they also wrote the Old Testament. And not only did they write the Old Testament, but they also invented Hebrew, and that the Jews never even existed. So, you know, I'm just saying I'm not going that far, and I'm not going too deep into this. I'm kind of scraping the surface on this theory here. You know, in case you want to call me some kind of raving conspiracy theorist, I'm using a lot of restraint here. Okay, so anyway, they backdated the story. One of the main themes that allowed the scholars to find this is that a lot of the things that Jesus prophesies or predicts in the New Testament, these things are fulfilled by Emperor Titus in the Josephus works. Now, Titus wasn't the emperor yet. He was still the general, the military general for this war. Same with Vespasian. Vespasian was originally the military general. When he became emperor, he appointed his son Titus as the general. So Jesus has a 3-year ministry in Judea. Titus has a 3-year military campaign in Judea. Many of the things that Jesus predicts are fulfilled by Titus. Where Jesus makes the prediction is the same location where Titus fulfills the prediction. When Jesus makes the prediction is 40 years, often to the hour of the time that Titus fulfills the prediction. And, you know, some people fall into the trap of saying, well, that's because Jesus was a prophet and he was predicting, you know, what was going to happen. But what that also means then is that Titus is the second coming of Jesus. And so you can put your Apocalypse or your book of Revelation away because that's already happened 1950 years ago. And so now Joseph Atwill in the early 21st century, 2005, his book Caesar's Messiah came out, and especially in his later edition called Flavian's Signature of Caesar's Messiah, Atwill found a whole lot of other parallels, and many of them are in order in both books. So they come in the same order in both books, and some of the parallels are almost mind-boggling in their detail and in their ability to stay hidden, even though they're like right in front of your face. So it's really like a genius work. Whoever put this together must have spent an amazing amount of time on it. But the Romans, the Caesars, they had that kind of time, and they had those resources. Now, what Menescotz does is he digs in even further, and he focuses on the book of Luke, and he compares the book of Luke to Josephus, and he found over 250 parallels between the two works, and then he graphed them out on a chart. The book of Luke on the vertical axis, Josephus's War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Every time he finds a parallel, he plots a point or puts a dot there. By the time he's done, he's got 250 dots on the page, and they form 5 letters in Latin. which is not noise, it is signal, and it is not a random pattern. It's very much engineered. And the upshot basically is that the Romans did not only write the New Testament, or at least in this case the Gospels, but they also signed their name to it. APTVS, Arius Piso Titus Vespasian. And so I think that's a pretty strong thing to put together, and that's why we're looking at this this work, and we're going to get into it. First, I'd just like to mention, though, that before you decide to discard this theory, you look at the motives. The Romans had the clear motive to do this because since the Jews had been under the empire of the Romans, the Jews had been a constant thorn in the side of the Romans for all of their insurrections and revolutions and wars that they fought against the Romans, mainly to maintain their way of life, their separatist God, that they believed they were the chosen people. They had many different kind of rituals, animal sacrifice, Passover rituals, in addition to strictures against graven images that made them have to have all the money changers outside the temple so that they could exchange the coins that had pictures of Caesar's, inscriptions of Caesar on them, to the Jewish coins that didn't, and also the circumcision. And so the Jews were willing to die for these things, and in many cases they did. But the Romans had to put resources toward this, and so they wanted to figure out a way to calm that down. And the Romans also had a monopoly on, really, they had the ability to write this, being written in Greek. The New Testament was the common language in Rome, even more so than Latin, and not so much in Judea. And they had a monopoly on the censorship. Anything that Caesar didn't like wasn't published, as you can see that from what survives from this time period. The only thing that survives is the New Testament and Josephus, with the caveat that in the last 100 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls were also discovered. So that we'll have to deal with at a certain point. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are primarily in Hebrew, some are in Aramaic, but some are in Greek. So I think personally that the Dead Sea Scrolls may have served as source material for the Romans, and that the Romans used them to create the story of the Gospels, and then they stashed them in a bunch of caves near Qumran. But anyway, the Romans also had a monopoly over publishing. They had thousands of slave scribes to put out thousands of copies of this thing. And they also had a monopoly over the postal service. So they were able to distribute them as well. And the Jews in Judea had none of these things. So that has to be borne in mind. Usually scholars, when they claim the historicity of Jesus, they use the argument of magical thinking. They say, oh, well, God did it because there's no other explanation. Unfortunately, with the Roman hypothesis, there is now another explanation. And that explanation is logical and is rational, and it is right down the middle of the MO of what the Romans would do, what they had done. They created several other religions in the first century for propaganda purposes. So this is not any kind of a stretch. This is right down the middle of what the Romans would do and had done already. Okay, so we're going to get into chapter 12 here for Menescot's, which is called Josephus's Life Story, being a parody of Jesus as a paradigm shift. Now, up till this chapter, Menescot's has been going over these 250 parallels that he found, kind of one by one, and showing how they filled out his little chart. So this is a little bit of a departure, and to be honest, I've read most of his work because it was online before I got it as a book. I have not read this, so this should be interesting. Josephus's Life Story, being a parody of Jesus as a paradigm shift. As demonstrated in the first two chapters, Luke parodies Jewish war. But here, I will demonstrate that there are two mutual parodies. I will show that Jewish war parodies Luke right back, and indeed in extraordinary detail. So that's how you really know that Josephus and the New Testament were written at the same time by the same people for the same reason, because they are mutually parodying each other. They're kind of bouncing off each other. It's not that one is constantly parodying the other. It's going in both directions. Historians generally see Luke as written after the fall of Jerusalem in 69 AD. And that it claims to foretell, and there can be no doubt Jewish war was written after that same event that it describes in such detail, and under the authority of Vespasian and Titus, which Josephus, so whoever Josephus was, says that that is what happened in his book. He says that Titus and Vespasian approve, in particular Titus. What I am suggesting is that Luke was therefore also written during the reign of Vespasian and Titus, which was from 69 to 81 AD. The other brother, Domitian, came in after 81 AD, and things changed after that. Hard to say if they changed radically or just a little bit. And that it was a conscious decision to make Luke describe a story of a peace-loving Messiah who had conveniently lived and died a generation ago, what in our calendar is around 1 to 33 AD, since it would make it hard for anyone at the time to refute the story. And that's something that I didn't mention, as part of the motive here. They were trying to neutralize the Jews, to get them to stop revolting from them. And, the Jews had Old Testament prophecies calling that there was going to be a Messiah coming in the first century. The Jews were waiting for a Messiah, but the Messiah they were waiting for was a wartime Messiah, a Messiah that was going to lead the Jews to expel the Romans by force. That's what they were waiting for. But instead, the Romans proposed a Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in turning the other cheek and rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking an extra mile with the soldier's backpack, and believing that the Roman slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Judea, telling the Jews to forgive the Romans for they know not what they do, and also for when Jesus does get rambunctious, he overturns the money changers who are Jews, and he disrupts the selling of doves and pigeons and lambs and rams outside of the temple for their animal sacrifices. So when Jesus does do something revolutionary, he does it against the Jews and against the rituals that the Jews have. The stricture against graven images in the temple and their animal sacrifices out at the temple. So that is the Jesus that the Romans or the Messiah that the Romans wanted. Jewish War states explicitly that its author is Flavius Josephus of the Flavian dynasty. Okay, Josephus, we'll talk about his story, but he was a member of the family of the Flavian dynasty. This Josephus takes the opportunity to describe his improbable life story within Jewish War, including the prophecies he supposedly made and his capture by the Romans and acceptance into the friendship of the Roman royal family. Astonishingly, no historian has previously noticed, or dared to publish perhaps, that at every turn he writes his autobiographical story in Jewish War to form a carefully hidden parody of Jesus Christ's story. Yet the number of degrees of carefully concealed similarities between Josephus's and Jesus's stories is truly staggering. Each one is subtle enough to avoid attention, yet when compiled and seen in aggregate, there is no chance that they can be coincidence, let alone that all of them would align perfectly with the APTVS pattern. It is surprising that it has gone unnoticed that Josephus's life story is a well-hidden parody of Jesus's. The only author I could find who noticed this is Cliff Carrington, who observed Josephus being in the cavern and being raised on the third day, but didn't go on to identify that there was far more to it. Some very obvious reasons why Josephus's story should have attracted greater scrutiny and doubt are set out below. Now, to be fair, I think Joseph Atwill does get into this at least a little bit, but it looks like Menescot's got into it a lot. So he's got a little table here. On one side, it's key aspects of Josephus's life story described in Jewish War, and also Vita, which is his autobiography. And then on the other side, it says, and why this story is utterly implausible. So he gives you Josephus's story, which is supposed to be kind of mirroring the story of Jesus. And then he's going to tell you why this is implausible. Okay, point number one. Josephus claims, he's got it in quotes, Josephus, because like me, he doesn't really believe that a person named Josephus ever existed, that it's a pen name for somebody else or some group of people. So Josephus claims he became the supreme Jewish military leader. And on the other side, it says, there is no contemporary Jewish writing mentioning them having such a leader. Okay, then point number two, Josephus is the only person to have ever claimed to be a member of the Essene sect. And, you know, some authors believe that Jesus was a member of the Essene sect. They were like a group of really super dedicated Jews who believed in like celibacy and, you know, how everything was just really super ascetic. They believed in giving all their money to the sect and all of this. Okay, so Josephus is the, and again, neither Menescot's nor I don't either believe that the Essenes ever existed. They're only mentioned in history by Josephus, Philo, and some other Roman. But the Christian apologists build up a whole story about the Essenes, even though they're, you know, based on Roman, you know, writings. Josephus is the only person who have ever claimed to be a member of the Essene sect, and also claims he left it and became the religious leader of the Jewish nation. why this is implausible. There is no Jewish record of any of this. There isn't a single Judean document prior to 70 AD which even mentions the existence of an Essene sect, which had supposedly existed for thousands of ages, in quotes. Also, there is no record of anyone claiming firsthand knowledge that the Essene existed, barring 3 people all closely associated with Josephus, Josephus's saviors, Titus and Vespasian. Again, I think it's Philo and Pliny and Josephus, but I'm not sure about the Pliny the younger. Okay, point number 3. Josephus claims he prophesied his own defeat and the very day it would occur, and told his own forces of this. Why this is implausible. No military leader would ever openly predict total defeat. Even if it was possible to make such an accurate prediction, it's obviously fiction. Point number 4. Josephus claims he prophesied that Vespasian and Titus were to become successors to Emperor Nero, even though Vespasian was supposedly of humble origins. Why this is implausible. Even if this were possible, no one would dare predict the fall of the current emperor for fear of execution. Josephus's claim to making prophecies and benefiting from divine assistance also mark him out as a liar. Okay, I don't see that as being as strong. Okay, Josephus claims that despite being a key enemy general, he was not only spared death, but was freed and then treated almost like royalty by the Emperor Vespasian, who gave him freedom, precious gifts, and lands, and tax-free status. Why this is implausible. This was not merely culturally and politically impossible, but contrary to Roman law. The expectation was for enemy generals to be taken to Rome to be publicly executed at the end of the triumph parade. The source that tells us that this was Roman law is Josephus himself. Okay, I think that's number 5 there. So this is number 6. Josephus claims that as their enemy general, immediately upon being captured, he was led to Vespasian, in quotes, and then Roman figures, including senior ones, commanders, crowded around their general, calling for Josephus's death until they got close enough to see him, then becoming concerned at the change in his fortune, and then they relented when they saw him. That's a little bit confusing. My attention might have slipped there for a second. This is why this is implausible. At face value, it is self-evidently nonsense that the senior Romans would want Josephus dead only to relent when they saw him. However, it makes sense once you appreciate that the senior rank of the secrecy cult were to be falsely told that the divinely clever Flavian emperors were the authors of Jewish war and Jesus' story, and that Josephus was their pen name. This explains why Jewish war describes Josephus and Vespasian in the same place. It's alluding to how senior Romans would hate the author of Jewish war, viewing him as their enemy, but would then suddenly love him once they can see that he is a fictional metaphor for their beloved emperor. Okay, that's, I think, I'm a little bit lukewarm on that one. Okay. Turn the page, and he's got some more analysis here. To this, we could add that the observation by the scholar Roman Piso that if you add up the claimed lineage of Flavius Josephus, the dates don't add up unless a whole succession of his ancestors had children oddly late in life. Right. But most implausible of all is the claim that Vespasian and Titus let him, their captured general, write the official record of what was not only their career-defining war, but the war that defined the politics of the era. To put this in full perspective, it is worth understanding how huge this war was. Based on the fatalities stated in Jewish war, based solely on fatalities on the Jewish side, this war caused a greater proportion of the world's population at that time to be directly killed than World War I and World War II put together. So this is like, again, but he's citing Josephus as the source for this. So, you know, I'm still thinking it's possible that this never occurred at all, because Josephus is the only source for it. Now, I don't think he's the only source for the war at all, but he's the primary source, and I think there is some archaeological evidence that back up that there was some kind of conflict there. So anyway, so this is like Hitler announcing to his own forces that Germany would be defeated, and succeeding in predicting it to the exact day. But then President Roosevelt intervening to save his life, the U.S. Senate deciding they liked him once they had seen him in person, and him being given U.S. citizenship, freedom from paying taxes, and permission to script all war-related content on PBS TV network and National Public Radio, and continuing the analogy to show how implausible Josephus' story is, all contemporary German records turn out to have no record of this Hitler person. Well, I don't know. It sounds like Menescotts hasn't heard of Operation Paperclip, because that's pretty much what did happen, is that it wasn't Hitler only, but it was the U.S. brought in thousands of high-ranking Nazis into the country after the war to work for high-ranking tech organizations like the CIA and General Electric and General Motors and NASA. And so that's exactly what happened, almost. So it's anyway, that just destroys his argument here. Hopefully, this comparison shows the extent to which it has been normalized to brush away the implausible elements of Josephus' story. I will end this chapter by explaining why most historians are convinced that he existed, mainly because other famous writers of the time just happen to have left us with letters in which they just happen to mention in passing how well they knew Josephus in person. But before that, I will describe the evidence that Josephus' story is a parody of Jesus's, as below. Okay, I think we're going to leave it off right there. I would like to at least give you a skeleton of the story that Josephus tells us about his